This next video that you're going to be watching will deal with the Chapter 14 in your textbook, the federal court system. What we're going to primarily focus on here is two basic things. We're going to first take a look at how a case makes it to the Supreme Court, or as we say, how it gets on the Supreme Court docket. And then the second part of this video that you'll watch will try to explain to you what the Supreme Court justices do with the case once it's made onto the docket. The first thing we need to notice by taking a look at this first slide that we see is that getting onto the Supreme Court's docket is very difficult. And when we talk about a docket, all we mean is a final agenda. A docket is a list of the cases that the Supreme Court will hear. For example, I got a driving ticket. I got a traffic ticket a couple years ago, and I had to go into court to plead this ticket. And when I walked in, there was a list of all the cases and in the order that those cases would be heard, and that's the docket. That just tells the court system which cases are going to be heard on which day. So keeping that in mind, you need to realize that getting on the docket of the Supreme Court, getting the Supreme Court to agree to hear your case, is a very, very difficult thing. There's two major sources from which the Supreme Court will get the cases that they choose to hear. They come from either through the federal court system, from either a district court in the federal system, or usually they will come from an appeals court within the federal court system. And the second source of cases for the Supreme Court are the state courts. Anytime during the state court process that a person believes that their federal due process rights have been violated, they can appeal their case to the Supreme Court. Now, keep in mind, just because you appeal your case to the Supreme Court does not mean that they have to hear your case. You need to keep in mind that there's approximately 7,500 cases a year that get appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which means 7,500 times a year there are people within the United States who say, my due process rights have been violated, and I believe the Supreme Court, the ultimate court in the land, should make a determination on this issue. Well, when you take a look at this slide, you'll see that while there's 7,500 cases a year are appealed to the Supreme Court, approximately 98% of those cases are denied. 98% of those cases, the Supreme Court decides that they're not going to hear the case. Okay? And as we discussed previously in class, you need to realize that two major reasons that the Supreme Court will turn a case down is, first of all, it's not a real case. Remember, the Supreme Court can only deal with real issues. If this is an issue that's being made up, or it's what we call, they're asking for some kind of a judicial interpretation, they're not going to hear that case. The only time they'll hear the case is when it's a real situation. And then the second time the second instance where the Supreme Court will deny a case will be if there's not a federal case. There's not a federal issue there. Okay? Remember, if I get stopped for rolling through a stop sign, I technically have the right to appeal that case to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court's not going to hear that case, not going to hear my arguments, unless I can prove that there's a federal issue there. Is there an issue involved in me driving through that stop sign and getting a ticket for that? That affects the whole country. And most of the cases the Supreme Court will deny will be basically denied on one of those two reasons. Okay? But let's say you're one of those 7,500 cases and you've appealed it to the Supreme Court. Basically, the way the process works is that the Supreme Court will first take that case that you've appealed, basically your brief, your written explanation as to why your case should be heard by the Supreme Court, and they will register it with the Secretary or whoever it is at the Supreme Court. And then that brief will be given to what we call court clerks. Supreme Court clerks, which means these are the best law school students in the country that have an opportunity to spend time working with the Supreme Court justice. And these clerks will go over these cases, they'll go through these cases, and they will summarize them for the Supreme Court justices, and they'll make some basic recommendations to the Supreme Court justices as to whether or not these cases are they real, do they have a federal issue, and then if they do have a federal issue, they will summarize that issue. They will try and summarize the court cases that have been heard in the history of our country dealing with that case. Those summaries are then handed out to all of the Supreme Court justices, all 9 of them, and the 9 Supreme Court justices will get together periodically, and they'll discuss these cases that come by. Okay, at one point or another, all 7,500 of these cases will be discussed, not all in detail, but they will all be discussed by the Supreme Court justices. And each one of those 75 cases that are found to have a federal issue and be real cases will actually have a vote taken with the Supreme Court justices. The Supreme Court justices will get together, the 9 of them, and the first thing that they're going to vote on is, should we hear this case? Is this case important enough for the Supreme Court of the United States to hear the case? In order for a case to be placed on the docket, in order for a case to be put on the agenda to say that the Supreme Court justices will review this case, you have to get 4 of the 9 justices to agree that your case is important enough, it's a real case, and there's a federal issue involved. If you get 4 of the 9 justices to agree that your case is one that the Supreme Court should listen to and has the authority to listen to, then you've made it onto the Supreme Court docket. Now realize, you only need 4, which is a minority of the Supreme Court justices, to agree that your case should be heard. That's called the rule of 4. If you get those 4 votes, all that means is that your case is going to be put on the docket, and that the Supreme Court will take a closer look at your case, and then they will come up with a decision on your particular case. Out of those 7,500 cases that are appealed every year, about 100 of them actually make it onto the Supreme Court docket. Okay? So, those 100 cases, in those 100 cases, the Supreme Court's going to continue to look at the case, they're going to do more research, and then they're going to issue an official opinion of the courts, which will explain as to, how they're ruling in the case. Has this person's due process rights been violated? Has this person been wrongfully convicted? Whatever the case happens to be. The other 7,400 cases that the Supreme Court has gotten during the year, there's going to be no decision made on it. Simply what the Supreme Court will say in those cases is, we don't think it's a federal issue, we don't think it's a real issue, or we don't think it's an important enough case for us to deal with. We're going to stand with the ruling of the lower courts. Okay? Remember, all you've done at this point is gotten onto the docket. Okay? Now the next video that you're going to watch is going to deal with how the Supreme Court actually deals with the case after it's been put on the docket and they've decided that they want to offer an opinion in this case.